Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Osterville Village Library. We are delighted to have you with us for today's program on the fascinating ecology and importance of seaweed, presented in partnership with the Barnstable Land Trust. Seaweed is an essential part of our coastal ecosystems, providing habitat for marine life, helping to improve water quality, protecting shorelines, and playing a vital role in the health of our oceans. We are especially pleased to welcome Gil Newton, one of the founders of the Barnstable Land Trust and a lifelong advocate for land conservation and environmental stewardship on Cape Cod. Through his decades of work, Gil has helped protect thousands of acres of open space and has inspired countless people to better understand and appreciate the natural world around us. Today, Gil will share insights into the remarkable role seaweed plays in our coastal environment and why it deserves our attention and protection. Please join me in welcoming the Barnstable Land Trust and Gil Newton.
And Sue would like to say a few words before we get started.
On behalf of Barnstable Land Trust, welcome. Since Gil was one of the founders of BLT over 40 years ago, we have grown significantly. We've helped protect over 11,000 acres in the town of Barnstable and over 1,200 directly. We currently have 5 active land projects, which is an unusual number for us. Usually it's one project at a time, but as land is disappearing quickly and in high demand, so is the value of our work. So this is a big year for BLT. We're just entering the public phase of the largest initiative in the organization's history, the For Now and Forever campaign, because when we protect a parcel, an acre of land, we protect it forever. And so we have lots of volunteers and a very tiny staff team that goes out and, monitors the properties, whether they have trails or not. So it really is an investment, not only for our, livability today, but for future generations too. I went around and gave out maps and little information about what we're doing, but you can also get those at our office on 6A. The library usually has maps, etc. The other thing is we do over 120 free programs like this one today. Gil did double duty today. He did one. We went on a lady slipper hunt last week, and hopefully there are more out now. And in fact, I'm dashing to go to yet another program we're doing at our Fuller Farm barn, which is on Route 149 in Marston Mills. If you haven't gone, it will be open till 3 o'clock for a drop-in. We're working on a 7-foot parade puppet that is a huge tree, and we're inviting the community to come in and help us create a crown of leaves. So if you're looking for a rainy day afternoon thing, which it's not raining yet, but do stop by. It's a beautiful post and beam barn, so it's a great excuse to get inside. So I will also now pass the mic over to Gil, who I always say, and it's true, Gil is one of my favorite people to go on a program with, because no matter how many different programs I hear Gil give, and he gives a lot of different ones, I always learn something. So be prepared, your brain will be full. So
don't worry, I won't give you a quiz. So thank you everybody for coming out today and talk about my favorite topic, which are the seaweeds. Now, that may sound a little strange at first. You probably never heard anybody say that in the past, but my background is marine biology. I am currently a professor of coastal ecology at the Cape Cod Community College, where I've been teaching there for many, many years. In addition to that, I have done research in this particular field, so I never lost my interest in seaweeds. And I want to introduce you to the variety that we have here on Cape Cod today and talk a little bit about their importance, both positive and negative, in our environment. So let's see if this is working. It is. Before we get started, however, I have to pay homage to this group of algae here. These are diatoms, or collectively referred to as phytoplankton. And just like the seaweeds, they are in the group called algae. So the seaweeds and the phytoplankton are no longer considered plants, And that's because they are missing certain structures that plants have. Namely, something called vascular tissue, which is the transport tissue for water, minerals, and sugars throughout the whole plant. But these organisms lack that. They don't need to. They're in the water column, so they absolutely do not need to worry about vascular tissue. Although there are a couple where some primitive forms of it might have evolved, but that's another story. At any rate, they do photosynthesize and they do bring in energy into the marine food web. And this group does it more than any other group on Earth. The phytoplankton are responsible for about 50% of the world's oxygen. Think about that a second. That means every other breath that you take of oxygen came from these microscopic organisms that are in the ocean. Most people don't even know about the existence of diatoms, much less understand their importance. I actually once had a bumper sticker made that said, "Have you thanked a diatom today?" But nobody understands what that means. The other thing too is they also are the base of the food web in the ocean. Because of their abundance and because of their biomass, they help support all living things all the way up to the large whales. So while they're not conspicuous, they're extremely important. But today we're talking about the ones that we can see, and those are the seaweeds. So the seaweeds are divided up into three basic groups based on their pigmentation: the green algae, the brown algae, and the red algae. And they differ in their distribution along the shore because of the different pigments in their tissues, which absorb different wavelengths of light. So on average, you usually find the green algae in the upper part of the intertidal zone, followed by the brown algae a little bit lower, and in the deeper waters, the red algae. That's not a hard, fast rule, but you do more or less follow that. Red algae, for example, can absorb blue light, which penetrates deeper down into the ocean. This one here is, I bet, one you've seen at the beach. This is called sea lettuce, or Ovalactuca. Sea lettuce is interesting because you can see where it gets its name. Looks like lettuce. It's actually more nutritious for you than garden lettuce. It has vitamins, minerals, and even protein in its tissues. This is an extremely common one that we have. And because it is edible, that doesn't mean I want you to run down to Dows's Beach and throw it on your salad tonight. And that's because it also has a couple of other characteristics that one has to be careful of. First of all, sea lettuce is nitrogen loving. So in many places in Barnstable and the rest of the Cape, you might see large sheets of it growing in the water column. Think of the Free Bays area in Barnstable or Shoestring Bay in Mashpee. That is because of a lot of runoff, mainly from septic systems that are washing into the bay, giving this influx of nitrogen, causing this algae bloom to take place. And sea lettuce does have also living on it some tiny animals sometimes, so it'll be kind of crunchy in your salad. So you have to be careful about that. They don't have a very long lifespan, only of a few weeks, but it is very common. However, it has been used in seaweed salads. It's been used in miso soups, for example, and it's usually grown, it has always grown in clean water conditions when it's used for those purposes. Before I forget, after the talk, you may want to come up and take a look at some of the preserved specimens that we have here. And I do have one of sea lettuce that you can take a look at. I'll say a little bit more about that. And I think I already passed out to most of you, but if you did not get a copy of my seaweed field guide, please help yourself, they're free. So help yourself to that on your way down. Now, there are other nitrogen-loving green algae in our waters. This is called Clodophora. It's not as bad as some of the others. It's a filamentous green. You often find it in the shallow areas of the intertidal zone. You can identify it by looking at the structure under a microscope here. But it's one that is growing in a huge abundance over at a place like Wacoit Bay. Clodophora is nitrogen loving, and it has now begun to outcompete some of our native species, particularly eelgrass. Eelgrass has disappeared from Wacoit Bay. Used to be quite common out there. It's completely gone now. And that's because of the nitrogen influx coming in from a number of sources. And Wacoit Bay is a shallow body of water. This is what it looks like at the bottom of the bay. In the summertime, I do a high school class for Wacoit Bay, and we go over to Washburn Island for a day. And we set anchor in Wacoit Bay, this was last summer, when we pulled up the anchor, it was just completely covered with this Cladophora. And also I was asked about an interesting phenomenon that's happening there. One of the researchers got all of this clogged up on the propeller of her engine in her boat. And she noticed there were these large mats floating to the surface during the day. What is happening is it is so thick at the bottom that at nighttime it stops photosynthesizing, but during the daylight hours, the sunlight penetrates down there and it's beginning to form oxygen bubbles. Those oxygen bubbles are getting trapped in these mats and causing it to float to the surface during the evening. So they're getting tons of this stuff out in the water, and you can see nothing can grow when this thing is covering the bottom. So it's an interesting one, but one that's a real big problem. Speaking of problems, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just gonna ask, would that be considered an invasive species? Because
It's native, so yes and no, I mean, it depends on your definition. A lot of people say if it's invasive, then it was introduced, like this one I'm gonna show you in a minute. But the truth of the matter is we do have some organisms that have been here for a long time that have taken on invasive qualities. Poison ivy, for example, greenbrier is another one. Rosa rugosa, in some cases, the state considers that invasive. So it could have been here for, 200, 300 years. It begs the question, when does it become a native? Periwinkle snails, for example, are introduced species. And yet they seem pretty common and been around forever. This one, however, is invasive and it was introduced. This is codium. Some people call it dead man's fingers. Some people call it the oyster thief. I bet you've seen this one if you've been to the beach. And here in Osterville, it's a real big problem, but not just here, throughout the Cape. I've seen this growing so abundantly in some of the beaches that the piles are taller than me. And this has been a problem I would say in the last 10 to 15 years. Codium was introduced into our waters, presumably on a shipment of oysters that came from Japan, went up into Canada and down into New England. And it wasn't a problem for a while, but now it is, because two reasons. One, our waters are nutrient rich, and two, the ocean is warmer and it loves those conditions. Now, why is this a problem? Because the branches tend to grow right over the filter feeding siphons of shellfish, so they're unable to filter feed. And it can even, because of its buoyancy, pull shellfish right up out of the water and up on the beach, hence the name oyster thief. And it has an advantage over native species. It can reproduce 3 different ways. If you were to see this at the beach and tear it in 2 and throw it back in the water, now you're going to have 2. And that's because it can grow by fragmentation. It basically has no cross walls between the cells, so the cytoplasm flows throughout the whole organism, creating basically one giant cell. And so it can just keep growing and growing if conditions are correct. On the tips, right up in here, they have these specialized structures called utricles, and they release male and female gametes into the water column. Fertilization takes place, and now you've got a whole new alga. But it can reproduce a 3rd way too. The female gamete can grow into a whole new alga without fertilization from the male. That's a process called parthenogenesis. So when you compare that with some of the native species that may have a very specific life cycle, microscopic stage in the winter and several stages in the summer, it gives this one has an unfair, if you will, advantage over those native species. And finally, it can grow year round. Even in our winters, you can find this growing out there in the cold water. So what do we do about this? Well, if you have a compost pile, this is excellent because it is loaded with nutrients and you don't have to wash the salt out. You don't have to worry about any odor. I use it on my rose bushes. I use it in my azalea bushes. I use it in my compost. There's no way I can make a dent in the population, but there isn't a town in Cape Cod that's going to tell you you can't take this off the beach. One of the things, however, I caution you about is I recommend you take it from the upper portions of the beach where it's kind of dried out and broken apart a little bit. It's a lot lighter that way, and it's less likely that you bring any live animals with you onto the property. So codium, it's been a big problem for years now. That's just another picture of it. Almost every beach that I go to, and I go to quite a few of them every single day, I have found this particular seaweed, sometimes in enormous concentrations. So though that was a couple of bad guys, let's talk about some of the good guys. This is rockweed. And rockweed is a very interesting group of seaweeds. There are several species on Cape Cod. What you see here in this picture are these swollen areas called receptacles. And can you see all the little bumps all along here? Each one of those bumps is something called a conceptacle. And if you were to take this back, like back to my lab at 4Cs, and you make a section of that conceptacle and look under the microscope, you would actually see the male or female reproductive structures. And what happens is when the tide comes in, those burst open, releasing the gametes into the water column. If the waves are agitating enough, and there's also a chemical attraction between the two gametes, fertilization takes place and it settles back down on the rock surface or shelf surface or the banks of salt marshes where it's very common. This is an important seaweed because it has a mucilage layer which tends to trap moisture. So a lot of animals will hide under the fronds at low tide, particularly during the warm months. It can be over 100 degrees on a surface of a jetty. So during those warm months, it will hide under there to prevent desiccation, to avoid predators, and basically to survive until the next tide comes back in. You'll also find some animals will even attach their larval stages or eggs to the fronds of this particular seaweed. So it's very important. And when you see it growing along the banks of a salt marsh, I did a walk at Crocker Neck for the Land Trust last week. We had a beautiful low tide. You can see that you have the cordgrass growing on the edge of the marsh. Then you have large clumps of rib mussels embedded in the marsh itself. And then you see the rockweed growing over the mussels. So the three of those organisms provide like a three-dimensional structure that holds the salt marsh banks in place. So it's important for erosion control as well. Remember, all these seaweeds are photosynthesizing. So that means they're also not only providing sugars and food into the food web, but they're taking up carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which helps us fight problems like climate change. So this is a really important one that we have. Now, sometimes you'll see them with the little pair air bladders along the edges, along the branches, excuse me. All right, now confession time. How many of you have ever popped those air bladders at the beach? One person can die, but you all have. Well, stop doing it. The only reason I say that is because they're filled with a gas, the atmosphere, and they help it float to the surface to maximize photosynthesis. So they're actually an adaptation for that particular seaweed. Now, the one that has the largest air bladders, and if you've been along the Cape Cod Canal, undoubtedly you've seen this. This is the knotted rack, Ascophyllum nodosum. So I like to call it the clambake alga because it does retain moisture, and this is the one that we use historically at clambakes here on Cape Cod. It still is. In fact, this is an important industrial product in states like Maine, where they use this to ship lobsters and clams all over the world because of its ability to retain moisture. They even have restrictions on how much you can take off the beach. These air bladders in some places can be up to 2 inches large, particularly over at Town Neck Beach and Sandwich, where the tide pools are kind of protected. This particular organism can live 20, 30 years. And so over time, it can get quite large and robust. Over the side, on both sides, this is the seaweed that you see. And you'll find lobster larvae, small fish, and other organisms living under its fronds at the canal. This is the other rockweed I mentioned a minute ago. There's the paired air bladders along the surface, and there's a rib mussel that it is attached to. So you can see there's several different ones here, and they all have pretty much the same kind of reproductive process. This is just a diagram of what it looks like. Again, if they're not plants, then we have to come up with a whole new set of terms, don't we? We can't say leaves, stems, roots anymore. Now we have to say things like fronds for the branches, the lamina for some of them, the stipe which is kind of like a stem-like structure. We have to have a structure called a holdfast, which has different parts to it called aptera. The holdfast is sort of like a root, but remember, it has no transporting tissue. It's just attaching itself to different things. And then this is a cross-section of what it looks like so that you can actually see inside here where it tends to have all these filaments packed together and then arranged with the mucilage that gives it that water retention ability. Now, there is another rockweed called the gulfweed, which is making the news and has for many years, not so much here, but definitely in Florida. I have a sample of it up here that you may want to take a look at. It looks like it has little berries on it, but those are the air bladders. This is sargassum. Sargassum is an interesting brown seaweed. It forms in the Gulf of Mexico, and then it gets transported all the way up the Gulf Stream and up here in New England. You might have heard of things like the Sargasso Sea, which we used to call the Bermuda Triangle. And that's because of all the myths of ships getting stranded and so forth in all of this seaweed that's out there. But it's a really important passageway for a lot of small animals that travel with it, not just small ones, some large ones too. For example, seahorses, pipefish, puffer fishes. They will come up to our beaches here in the summer traveling on the seaweed. And it even has some animals that live in that seaweed that look just like it, they mimic it. There's a crab and there's a fish that looks just like the sargassum itself. It's also a place where you might find sea turtles moving up and down the coast along with this seaweed, and even great white sharks will sometimes be seen in this area as well. Now, it's big problem in Florida right now. It's been washing up on the beaches on the West Coast and in Mexico and the Caribbean and other places by the tons. It's hard to exaggerate how much it's been washing up, to the point where it's costing them hundreds of millions of dollars of loss in tourism and fishing and so forth. It creates a huge smelly mess on the beaches. It gives off hydrogen sulfide gas when it decomposes, which can affect people with respiratory problems, and they don't know what to do about it. There's some research going on to try to turn it into a fertilizer, try to make it into a food source for farm animals, not really edible by humans, although every time I research something like this, someone somewhere is eating a seaweed. But it's not a problem on Cape Cod. Here on Cape Cod, its presence is not a big problem. You do see it here at Dowson's, you do see it around the Cape, but it is simply not an invasive species here. Why is it a big problem? Same story. Gulf of Mexico is loaded with nutrients from agricultural runoff all the way through the Mississippi River, all emptying into that area. There's huge dead zones in there, and also warmer temperatures. That's a combination that seaweeds love, and not just this one, but many others as well. So gulfweed is not a problem here on the Cape, and I don't anticipate that it will be. Now, there are some seaweeds that we've heard about. Everybody's heard about kelp and how important it is. Kelp is a major food source and supplementary food source all over the world. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's used in many products. This is the large kelp off the coast of California called Macrocystis, which has air bladders the size of baseballs, and the alga itself can be up to 150 feet long. Creates a whole forest with a canopy and so forth throughout the entire coastline. And is a very important seaweed to grow because it has all these valuable products, one in particular called alginate, which is used as a supplement in many products. When I taught the little toddlers an hour or so ago, I held up a picture with some kids eating ice cream. And I said to them, "What are they eating?" And they go, "Ice cream." I go, "They're also eating seaweed." And that's because there is seaweed in ice cream, in Jell-O, in toothpaste, in beer, in cake, I didn't tell them that, in cake mixes, in bread mixes, and all kinds of products, cosmetics, medicines, and that's because it acts as an emulsifier, acts as a stabilizer. In other words, it's not exactly a liquid and not exactly a solid like a rock, kind of in between. So that texture is due to the presence of a couple of products, one called carrageenan, which is an extract from red seaweed, and one called alginate, which is an extract from brown seaweed. And kelp is very nutritious for you as well. We have one here on the Cape. That's this one. This is laminaria, or now called saccharina. This is the sugar kelp, and there's actually, people are growing this in New England, and making, a lot of money on this because they can sell it as an extract all over the planet. It is very nutritious. This is a little piece of it, gets even bigger than this here on the Cape, but it is an important one and, one that, like I say, can be cultivated. And this is how they cultivate it. They grow it in these large sheets, and then they pull it up out of the water and they dry it. They dry it, and then it's processed and used for multiple products everywhere. So this particular one has a great deal of value, and they're always researching new ways of trying to use it for who knows what, food, cosmetics, fertilizer, and what have you. There was an attempt a few years ago to suggest that if we grew seaweed farms, we could help take up a lot of the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere, which is something we're trying to do all over the world, because they are more efficient than trees, for example, in taking up CO2. But here's the problem. A tree can live 100, 200 years. These organisms may live at the most a couple of decades. So when they do die and decompose, that carbon gets released back into the environment. So there have been some suggestions from researchers that maybe if we grow this and somehow embed it into the ocean sediments, we can trap a lot of that carbon, use it as sort of a big absorbent, and then many years later, somehow get it down into the sediments themselves where it gets trapped. Kind of like what a salt marsh does, how the peat builds up over time. All of that peat is carbon from previous populations of cordgrass, and the marshes are very efficient, more efficient than tropical rainforests in holding on to that carbon. So that sounds like an expensive operation. And that's one of the drawbacks to something like that. And it's not the solution, it may be one solution, but it's something to think about because these organisms are very good at absorbing carbon. Now, a few years ago, one of my college students came to me, he said, "Professor, what is mung?" He says it gets all over the fishermen's nets, and people are swimming in it, and it's a mess down at the National Seashore. So I said, well, it could be a number of things. Bring me in a sample and I'll look at it under the microscope. So he did, and I said, oh, you've got plurilocular gammatangia. So you must have ectocarpus. There's actually another one. Yeah, right. There's another one very similar to that called Pileella. It's kind of hard to tell them apart, but they have this very unique reproductive structure. It looks like a baseball bat. They're all there. They can be told apart by how it's arranged along the branches. The problem is this thing is so slimy that when you pull it out of the water, the branches are all over the place. It's very hard to see. So I suspect someday those two genera are going to be merged together as the same one. Who knows? These days, usually it's the splitters that have taken over taxonomy, but I suspect they're very, very similar. Anyway, I thought it was ectocarpus, and that's what it looks like. We have some unusual seaweeds on the Cape. This is actually a digital drawing because this is a hard one to find. It is found on Cape Cod, and whenever I find it, I'm jumping up in the air and just so thrilled about it. I have it in my field guide. It's called the sea colander or Agerum probosum. It's a very large, very dark kelp, about this big, riddled with holes. It looks like somebody's been nibbling on it, but in reality, it's its growth habit. As it grows, the tissues tend to tear apart, creating all of these perforations along the blade. And it is really beautiful. I used to do a marine science course up at Rye, New Hampshire, and we always spent a week up there collecting. And we used to find this quite a bit, actually. If you could walk out there, it's kind of hard with all the rockweed, but it was growing a little bit deeper water. And we do find it here too. One of my students brought me a sample from Plymouth last year. Here's one. I have a press specimen of this also for you to see. This is an interesting one. This is called the sausage alga. See where it gets its name? Okay, cytosiphon. We normally think of plant-like organisms or plants that only grow in the summer, right? This one only grows in the winter. This is one we have a couple like this. This one is a cold water species. And I usually collect it in January or February on the Cape. I have found it at Douses, actually a pretty good population there over by the walkway. And then it disappears in the summer. So not all of these species are going to be found in warm water. Many of them will be found when the water gets much colder. There it is, my favorite seaweed on earth. This is the sea potato. This is Lethesia deformis. And I bet you've not seen this one. It's not that common. It grows as an epiphyte on Irish moss and eelgrass. Some years you see a lot of it. I've been seeing a lot over a surf drive in Falmouth, which little kids in the summertime, Falmouth Academy, and we always go there once a week. And in about late June, maybe mid-June, late June, early July, you start to see this washing up on the beaches. But I'll tell you a funny story. I used to collect it at South Cape Beach in Mashpee, one of my favorite beaches, and then I didn't see it for 2 or 3 years. So I was taking my 4C students there on a field trip one evening, and I said to them, an automatic A if anybody finds the sea potato. Well, I should have looked first, because seconds later, they came back with handfuls of them. Is this what you're looking for? So a lot of good grades that evening. But anyway, this is a hollow seaweed. It actually, if you were to cut it open, you see all these filaments wrapped around it. Looks like brown popcorn, about so big. There is an imposter on the Cape now, a much larger one that was introduced called Culpamenia that I've been finding over the canal. But this is the one that's really interesting. I had special permission when I was teaching at Mass Maritime. I had special permission to go out on the dock and collect it there. So that was often a favorite collecting spot. The sea potato, it's in the book. Here's another one that I always like, and I'm seeing more of it now. This is called the sea whip. See where it gets its name? The sea rope, sea lace, horta is a scientific name. And this long, thin seaweed is actually a kelp. It's actually a kelp because of its life cycle. And you have this, you could jump rope with this. Some people could, I can't, but you can actually stretch this out quite a distance. And at the base is a little tiny disc-shaped holdfast. So I'm seeing a lot of this washing up on our beaches for usually in the summertime. So people often ask me, what's the prettiest seaweed? That's, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? Especially when it comes to seaweed. But this is one I would pick. This is Dacia or chenille weed. This is a red seaweed. And did I bring any today? Oh, I didn't bring any today to show you. Let's do that. Well, there's a nice picture of it. When you pull it up out of the water, it just kind of collapses, but it makes a nice pressed specimen like this because it's all these thin filaments you see along the branches. Now, I bring this up because in the field guide, I describe this as a warm water species. What we're seeing on the Cape right now is we're seeing a change in the kinds of species because of warmer ocean temperatures. It may not seem warm to us, especially after this last winter, but overall, ocean temperatures increasing. And it doesn't have to go up by much to start seeing changes in some of the populations. Give you an animal example. Lobsters are migrating north. They don't like temperatures over 68 degrees Fahrenheit, and we're getting water temperatures in the 80s now in the summertime. We're also seeing a replacement of the cold water brown algae species with the warm water red algae species. So I'm seeing more of this now at our beaches. I saw this, it was about a year or two ago, a population bloom of this at Calmus Beach in Hyannis in November. And usually would disappear around early September. So it's clearly responding to the warmer temperatures. And, I don't know what that means, if it's good, it's bad, it just is. And we notice these changes are happening. So some species are increasing while others might be decreasing. This is an unusual red seaweed. This is called corallina or coral weed. This particular seaweed is able to take limestone or calcium carbonate, whoops, what did I do? There we go, out of the water column and secrete it around its tissues. So it looks like a little statue. When it's alive, it's kind of purple. When it dies, it turns white, it looks like little bones. And it has these articulations along the branches, in between the branches, so that when the waves hit, it doesn't snap in two, just kind of flows back and forth. This ability to calcify is not that unusual in seaweed. It is unusual in northern waters. It's more of a southern waters phenomenon. So if you go down to South Florida and you go out by the coral reefs, you see a lot of seaweed that look like little statues in the water. And they help build up the coral reef by taking the limestone out of the water and making on their tissues. The question is, how does it photosynthesize if it's covered with limestone? And apparently there have been studies done which shows just enough sunlight penetrates that so that they can continue to photosynthesize. And the adaptation is to prevent herbivory by small animals. Okay, this is the one we all like to eat. If you like sushi, this is nori. This is the wrap around sushi. I know it turns kind of green after it's been processed, but it's a red seaweed. This is another sample of it right here, what it looks like. Very, very nutritious. As a matter of fact, you can buy nori and eat it directly. I have some samples here. There are these seaweed snacks that you can get at places like Job Lot. This is one of my favorites. It's a crispy seaweed. It's also nori. And this one I haven't tried yet because it looks like it might be an acquired taste. Fish and cheese flavored seaweed. Okay, but the point is they are very nutritious. Not only do they have a lot of vitamins and nutrients and low in calories, but they have protein in them as well. And some of them have B12, some of them have iodine, a lot of them have iodine, many very important substances that we have to have. So they're a nutritious snack for people and a low calorie, low salt alternative. Nori is widely used around the world, particularly in Asian countries, where it is a huge industry. And that is because they now understand its life cycle. So for many years, they could only grow nori during a certain portion of the year. This is in places like Japan, China, Korea, the Philippines, places like that were very, very, very common. They could only grow to a certain portion of the year. And then there was a scientist in England, Manchester, England, named Dr. Kathleen Drew Baker. And Dr. Baker, though she never left England, never went to Japan, was doing research on red algae life cycles. And she discovered that this particular seaweed has a microscopic stage, which she called the contracella stage, that lives on shellfish. And once she worked out that stage, shellfish shells, once she worked out that particular stage, now the industry was able to grow this all the time, year round. And it increased their profits and increased their productivity enormously. So today there's actually a statue in Dr. Baker's honor somewhere in Japan, not sure where. It's got to be the only statue of a seaweed scientist on Earth, and I'm aware of it. But like I say, she never left England. And today she's revered by not just the people involved with nori production, but it got us to start to look at many other species as well. Maybe they have a different stage to their life cycle, and many were discovered as a result of her work. By the way, in my class, you'd have to know that life cycle, so you don't have to worry about it. This is how they collect it. They collect in these wraps and mats, of course, and then dry it all out, process it. And like I say, it's used in an enormous number of products, or eaten directly. Some parts of the world, that's a part of the diet every single day, and very nutritious. So we do have one on Cape Cod historically. This is Irish moss, Chondrus crispus. It was a big industry in Massachusetts, particularly in places like Situate, Massachusetts. Irish immigrants would use it to supplement the fishing industry from the late 19th century to around World War II. In fact, there's a museum in their honor, I believe, in Situate. And this is a very sweet tasting, very nutritious seaweed. It was a major source of that carrageenan I mentioned a few minutes ago. Now they use other red algae for that as well. Used to collect this in rakes, still find it in a lot of places. It's very common here in the Cape. I think I do have a pressed specimen of it right here for you to look at if you'd like. And so that was a big industry here on the Cape. Seaweeds are also being considered as a biofuel. In fact, every algae species can be used as a biofuel and have been successful. They've even developed a jet fuel using some of the algae. The problem is right now, investments in this area have been declining. It's a lot less expensive to continue to invest in fossil fuels and wind and solar power and things like that. But it has been used successfully in some parts of the world, and it is, like I say, one of the other options. It burns cleaner than fossil fuels. It's certainly abundant and easy to grow, and it's very effective. So it's possible that someday we might see more of this in our transportation. So now let me tell you about a horror story. This is a seaweed called Caulerpa taxifolia. This was one that was artificially developed at a science lab in Monaco and accidentally thrown over. And it was mainly designed as an aquarium plant, aquarium seaweed, a very robust version, and it started to spread. In fact, it spread throughout the Mediterranean, it's wiped out several species. It has spread through other parts of the world. It's now banned everywhere. It even got into a lagoon in San Diego, California. And the only way they could recover it is by pumping chlorine into the lagoon, killing every single thing, and then allowing them basically to come back again, which they have, by the way, more or less. It can grow up to a half an inch a day. It completely carpets the ocean floor. It is a very dangerous and invasive species. I used to collect Caulerpa species in Florida, but nothing like this. They were native, they're much smaller. This was, like I say, hybridized in a lab in order to develop an aquarium seaweed. But at any rate, it's a real big problem. This is a picture of the scientist that discovered it, a French scientist, and he found it just completely carpeting miles and miles of the floor of the Mediterranean, where it's been a big, big issue. So we better hope we never get this on the Cape. The thing is, it really likes much warmer water than we have. You know, I've been saying our water's warmer, it likes it even warmer than what we have. The trace mixture, it would really be a big problem. So needless to say, these days, everybody's watching this. I don't know if you've ever seen the program on PBS Nova. They've done 2 or 3 specials on this one seaweed. That's how significant it is, and in the eyes of many. We do have another seaweed now. This is over in Katuitt at Crocker Neck. This is was asked by Barnstable Water Coalition a couple of years ago about this one. It's identified now as Heterosiphonia japonica. It was introduced into New England around 2007 or so. It's now spread throughout all of New England. It is a red seaweed. In fact, this gets so thick. I've had some students and I go in here and we've actually rescued sea cucumbers and other animals that have been stranded in this particular seaweed. You might be familiar with this particular spot. This is the beach right down at Crocker Neck. And this was a couple of years ago. I haven't seen a problem yet this year, but if it is, it's going to be in big vats like this. So it's a shallow body of water. That's Papaneset Bay. It's a shallow body of water, and it can really create a problem. When it dies and decomposes, it looks like this. It smells bad. It chokes off every. Sometimes it gives off hydrogen sulfide gas. So this is a problem. In fact, if you look carefully, there's a sea cucumber right now. There's another one right over here. There's another one right over here. So you see, they can get stranded in that and they won't survive. So we pick them up, put them back in the water. Okay. And then yours truly, I love teaching seaweeds to kids and to adults and to people all over, whoever wants to listen. I talk about seaweeds. This is me in a 7th grade classroom over at Sandwich. When I pulled that out, I heard, ooh, you know. But eventually I got them to pass around. That is, of course, codium. They were studying invasive species, so I thought I'd bring that in to show them. And they were very, very interested in that because they'd all started seeing this at the beach. I think that's my last slide. It is. So before I wrap things up, let me just tell you about some of the things we have up here. I haven't gone over them. This is the other cool water species we have. This is a brown alga called Punctaria. Sometimes grows along with the sausage alga. This is a really common red seaweed called Polysiphonia. Now look at that thing. It looks very, very simple, doesn't it? Been around a long time. This drove me crazy as a graduate student because I was put in charge of identifying the Polysiphonia species in South Florida. This has 3 different stages to its life cycle. It's influenced by the environment. It hybridizes easily in the environment. There are several hundred species. This thing still gives me nightmares today. But it's easy to identify by genus because it has, if you look at the cells, it's got these bands of red that we call pericentral cells, and that gives it away. We have another very common seaweed that takes many different forms. This is a red seaweed called Gracilaria. Gracilaria can be really thick or it can be real thin like this. I see a lot of this still at Wacoit Bay, and it takes on many variants in the environment. So some people have trouble with the species names. And then this is an interesting red seaweed. This is beginning to replace some of the kelp over at Town Neck. This is very abundant now. This is called Palmaria. Palmaria, it's in the field guide. Palmaria is interesting though, from a couple of points of view. Not only is it a pretty seaweed and beginning to grow more abundantly in our waters, but some scientists on the West Coast were feeding it to the sea urchins, and they tried a little bit themselves and said, hey, this tastes like bacon. So they're thinking, well, maybe we can market a new seaweed. You know, we're always trying to find plant alternatives to meat products. So don't be surprised if you start seeing an alternative to bacon in the supermarket that looks like that. So again, please help yourself to field guide. If you know somebody who would like one who's not here today, grab an extra copy. I thank you for coming out this morning. Thank you very much. Now, answer any questions.
Red tide is a term used in Florida. That's with red algae.
No, good question. He asked about red tide. Red tide is the one in Florida is different than the one here. Red tide is, remember that slide I showed you of the phytoplankton at the beginning? Well, there's another group of phytoplankton called the dinoflagellates. And they are responsible for the red tide that we have here. So it's an algae bloom of microscopic algae, which usually happens around this time of the year. And they can overwinter in the form of a cyst, and then conditions are right, they just come back out. So red tide is that these dinoflagellates, these microscopic algae, have a neurotoxin in their tissues. When the shellfish are filter feeding, they store that neurotoxin in their tissues. So if you come along and eat the shellfish, you get something called PSP, or paralytic shellfish poisoning. And it can make you very sick. Over time, they start to decline in numbers, and the shellfish are continuing to filter feed, so they get rid of the toxin and the organism, and then they can reopen the shellfish beds. The one, and so it has nothing to do with the tide, and it doesn't turn the water red, and it's not red algae. But the one in Florida, there are several species, and that can be a problem because you could actually, I mean, you could swim through red tide here and it wouldn't affect you at all. But there's different species in Florida that can cause sores, respiratory problems. They give off something in the atmosphere and the water. And so again, they're not red algae, but they're microscopic algae. Okay? And even in other parts of the world, there are other species too, that they just kind of lump under that category, red tide. The one here is caused by a dinoflagellate called Alexandrium. And we had a real serious outbreak of this about 15, maybe 20 years ago, that it even killed humpback whales that were getting a lot of the neurotoxin. And I know they closed shellfish beds down all over the Cape and even on the islands for quite several weeks. It even affected the tourist industry a little bit, though you never know that from the traffic, right? But it did affect it a little bit because people didn't understand it. Okay, but in the last, I haven't heard of a big problem yet this year. Usually over at the Nauset Marsh area, you can almost set your watch fire, because in that salt pond, there's a large population of these organisms, and they do have to shut that down temporarily. Good. Yeah, I forgot to mention red tide. Thank you for asking that. Any other questions?